Imagine you're playing a game online and you discover a glitch, one stupidly simple exploit that spits out coins every time you tap it. No grind, no skill, no risk, just a mechanical flaw that turns a normal game into a money printer. Now imagine the admins catch you. They see the pile, they see the pattern, you're expecting a ban, but instead, they offer you a deal. Give us a small cut. And you can keep doing it. Be honest, what would you do? You'd pay, and you'd keep tapping, because at that point, it's not a penalty, it's a license. That sounds like a story you'd hear on Reddit. But in the real world, on Wall Street, there's a version of this that's been documented, dated, and stamped by the people who are supposed to police the system. And the glitch isn't a theory. It's a tactic with a name, used to bend markets without looking like you touched them. Here's the bridge you need to make before we go any further. If a market can be influenced by an exploit, then what you're seeing on your screen isn't natural behavior. It's behavior inside an environment that can be steered quietly, mechanically, and repeatedly by whoever knows where the buttons are. And that's why we have to start with one uncomfortable reset. Silver isn't volatile, not in the way people casually say it. Like weather, what you're looking at is closer to an engineered environment, like a competitive game where the scoreboard is real. But the rules can be bent by whoever knows the exploit. And that exploit has a name. It's not a rumor. It's not a meme. It's a mechanical trick you can repeat over and over to move other players exactly where you want them. Spoofing. If you've never heard the word, that's not your fault. The system doesn't advertise its own cheat codes. It wraps them in jargon, hides them behind liquidity, and tells you price is simply the honest outcome of supply meeting demand. But ask yourself a basic question: if price discovery is fair, why do the biggest moves so often arrive like ambushes, straight down through obvious support, straight up through obvious resistance, then snapped back into place as if nothing happened? That's not chaos, that's choreography. This story doesn't open by begging you to believe in some shadowy conspiracy. It opens like a case file being slid across a desk. 4 parts, 4 locks, and the goal is simple: show you the mechanism that can push price, cap rallies, and manufacture crashes on demand. Then ask the only question that matters once you've seen it: why is this still allowed? The anchor isn't a forum thread or a clipped screenshot. It's government records, specifically the Department of Justice, laying out what the bank's traders did across multiple metals. For years, not weeks, roughly 8 years of manipulative behavior. Admitted in public, attached to a headline number big enough to sound like justice: $920 million. That number is supposed to be the period at the end of the sentence. But it isn't, because the point isn't that wrongdoing happened. The point is what the wrongdoing implies about the market you think you're trading. A one-off scandal is a story about bad actors. 8 years is a story about a machine. And machines don't run for 8 years unless they're profitable, repeatable, and tolerated. Spoofing, at its core, is the oldest trick in any marketplace. Create a fake impression of overwhelming selling or buying pressure, and let everyone else do your work for you. You don't need to dump real supply. You just need the crowd to believe there's a wall, to panic,
we need
to
to
step
finalize
away,
the Q4
to hit
projections
stops,
by midnight.
to chase.
I'm sending the encrypted
illusion
file
does
now.
the heavy lifting.
Received.
Then
The
the
board meeting
illusion
is set for
vanishes.
0800
The order
hours.
gets cancelled, and the transfer is already complete. Wealth moved from the reactive to the prepared. That's why the infinite money glitch metaphor isn't drama, it's accurate. A glitch is a flaw in a system that can be exploited repeatedly to generate an unfair advantage. The only thing more alarming than the exploit is the response to it: documentation, admissions, penalties, and business continues. So here's the opening promise. And it's a cold one. You're not watching silver behave like a natural market. You're watching it behave like a managed environment where the most important question isn't, where is price going? It's, who has the ability to make it go there? If the first idea rewires your trust in the market, the second one rewires your trust in the screen. Because once you accept that silver can be engineered, the next question is unavoidable. How do they actually do it without dumping real metal? Here's where the story slows down and gets surgical. Because spoofing isn't magic. It's a visual hack, a way to manufacture a wall that looks like overwhelming supply, even when no one intends to sell a single ounce. Picture the order book like a stage. Most people treat it like a truth machine. Green bids below, Red offers above, and the bigger the block, the more real it feels. Now imagine an algorithm walks onto that stage and drops a massive sell order right at a key level, thousands of contracts. A number so large it reads like tens of millions of ounces. The message is simple, and it hits the human brain instantly. You can't get through this. That one block becomes a psychological object. Traders start narrating it to each other. There's a whale up there. Buyers hesitate. Some pull their bids. Others stop chasing. Momentum flips, not because supply actually hit the market, but because fear did. And fear is liquid. Once the crowd believes the wall is real, they do what crowds always do. They adjust. They front run. They sell early so they don't get trapped. Stops get tucked tighter. Weak hands hit market orders. Price starts to slide, and the slide itself becomes proof that the wall was real all along. That's the genius of the trick. The spoof doesn't need to execute. It needs to be seen. It needs to trigger a chain reaction where everyone else supplies the selling pressure for free. Then comes the key move, the part that turns big order into fraud. The wall disappears. The sell order gets cancelled because it was never meant to fill. It was a bluff, a hologram. The market just reacted to a ghost. And by the time most participants realize it, the damage is already done. Price has been shoved lower. Liquidity has thinned. And the same player who painted the fake wall can now step in as a buyer, calmly scooping at levels they themselves helped manufacture. The transfer happens in seconds. Panic sells into the hole. The operator buys into the fear. And the tape later looks like an ordinary move. Just volatility. Just sellers. But the script doesn't let it stay abstract. It labels it plainly. Illegal, framed as banned under Dodd-Frank, yet brutally hard to police because it runs at machine speed. By the time anyone can point to the deception, the order is gone, the chart has printed, and the profit has already changed hands. And that's the point of this section, to break your default intuition. Depth isn't always demand and supply. Sometimes it's theater, designed to move you, not inform you. Once you see spoofing as theater, the next realization is darker. The audience doesn't just watch the play, the audience pays for it. Because the real advantage isn't the fake wall itself. The real advantage is what that wall does to the people who believe it. Especially the ones trading from the outside looking in. This is where the script stops talking about a trick and starts explaining why the same pattern keeps showing up as a personal disaster for retail. Why those sudden, violent drops feel like mystery ambushes that arrive with no warning and no explanation. The core is information asymmetry. And it's brutally simple. The bank, or the operator running the algo, knows which orders are real and which orders are bait. Because they're the ones placing the bait. Everyone else is forced to treat the screen like a window into truth. Level 2 depth bars, ladder charts, big red blocks of sell liquidity. They look objective. They look like evidence. Your brain reads them the way it reads a crowd. If enough people are standing in one place, something must be there. That's the vulnerability spoofing exploits. It hijacks the natural assumption that displayed liquidity equals real intent. So when the wall appears, the market doesn't need to be pushed. It pushes itself. Think about what the retail trader experiences in real time. You're watching price climb. You see a massive sell wall appear at a key level. It feels like a hard ceiling, like someone with unlimited supply just drew a line across the chart. You hesitate. You reduce size. You move stops. You take profit early. Or you do the opposite, you short. Because you assume the wall is smart money, defending a level. Either way, you've made a decision based on a visual signal you couldn't verify. And then it hits. Price drops hard. Not gradually, but violently, like the floor fell away. Your stop loss triggers. Your broker fills you in the worst possible place. The book thins out. Slippage shows up. And now it's not just a trade, it's a shock. This is the moment most people describe as a flash crash. And the script reframes it as something colder, a planned harvest. First, a spoof creates the illusion of overwhelming supply, which flips sentiment and starts the sell cascade. Second, that cascade reaches the mechanical layer, stop-loss clusters, margin calls, forced liquidations, orders that must execute regardless of price. Once those forced orders start firing, Price
Trade
becomes a
guarantees are
vacuum. The
materialized
order book
through our
gets cleared
secure
like a
network.
hallway in a stampede.
As connections
and
lock
right
into
there,
place,
inside the
stability
chaos,
is ensured.
the operator doesn't need to be brave. They just need to be early. They buy into the panic they helped create. Then, when the stops are exhausted and the forced selling is done, price rebounds fast. The tape prints a neat V shape. The chart looks like volatility. And the trader who got stopped out is left staring at the screen like it betrayed them, confused, embarrassed, and broke, asking the same question every time. Why did it drop? There was no news. That question is the trap. Because no news makes the move feel random. Randomness makes you blame yourself. And self-blame keeps you from blaming the mechanism. The script's persuasion comes from matching a pain pattern almost every trader recognizes. The move that only exists long enough to hit your stop. The drop that feels engineered to find your level. The snap back that happens right after you're out. It's not just that you lost money. It's that you lost it in a way that feels insulting, like you were targeted. And this is where the story escalates beyond one illegal tactic into a bigger diagnosis: broken price discovery. If visible supply can be faked at scale, then the intersection of supply and demand isn't the market clearing, it's the stage clearing. The displayed price becomes less like a neutral result and more like a simulation, one where the most powerful players can rewrite the inputs. Watch the crowd react, and collect the difference. Once you accept the flash crash as a harvest, the next question isn't emotional anymore, it's forensic. Is this just a few bad days and a few bad traders? Or is it a system that's been built to do this? Because the difference matters. A rogue trader is a headline. A repeatable method is a business. And this is where the narrative shifts from describing the experience to tightening the chain of proof, leaning hard on the Department of Justice not as a symbol, but as a source of record. The script's posture becomes almost prosecutorial. You're not being asked to feel that something is wrong. You're being asked to look at what the government itself documented, and then notice what that documentation implies. The key move is to argue that the evidence doesn't read like an accident. It reads like an institution. Trade data can show patterns, but patterns alone can always be shrugged off as aggressive execution or market making. What makes the case heavier, according to the script's framing, is the idea that the DOJ record points beyond charts and timestamps into behavior. How the desk operated, how people communicated, how the tactic was used repeatedly across years and across multiple metals. That's the pivot from, this happened, to, this is how they work. Because if spoofing was rare, you'd expect it to look sloppy and isolated. If spoofing was profitable, you'd expect it to be refined, repeated, and shared. And the script pushes the viewer toward that conclusion. This wasn't one person getting reckless. This was a trading desk environment where the trick wasn't accidental, it was normalized. It was part of the craft. The kind of thing that gets joked about, referenced casually, and, most importantly, taught. That cultural framing is a weapon. Because it upgrades the accusation. Someone cheated is a moral story. Cheating is the process, is a structural story. The narrator's thesis becomes sharper. The largest banks aren't primarily winning in metals by predicting inflation or reading macro like a monk. They're winning by manufacturing conditions, by creating volatility, forcing stops, and extracting from predictable human behavior. When you can trigger fear, you can trigger orders. When you can trigger orders, you can trigger price. And when you can trigger price, forecasting becomes optional. The house doesn't need to guess the next card if it can tilt the table. This is where the tone turns colder and more accusatory. Because the market is no longer described as a neutral arena where everyone competes under the same physics. It starts to resemble a casino where the house can adjust the lighting, the rules, and the payout schedule mid-hand, while still telling you it's fair, because the chips have printed values. And that mental model is the trapdoor the script wants you to step through. If manipulation is embedded in process and training, then it doesn't end with a fine or a scandal. It persists until incentives change. Which means the story can't stop at, they got caught. It has to keep going into the machinery that made getting caught survivable: law, regulation, and the uncomfortable relationship between state power and the financial infrastructure it depends on. And once you've accepted that the behavior looks institutional, desk
When
culture,
liquidity stress hits
repeat
the market,
patterns,
a quiet
years of
force
repetition,
takes hold.
the natural next question isn't, did they do it? But, so what happened to them? Because in every normal version of justice, proof leads to consequences that change behavior. Yet here, the story hits its twist. The punishment doesn't feel like a shutdown, it feels like a recalculation. The script pivots from the crime itself to the legal container that quietly allows the machine to keep running, the Deferred Prosecution Agreement. The DPA, an arrangement that sounds technical, almost boring, until you realize what it accomplishes. In plain terms, the deal reads like this: the bank pays a massive penalty, admits to misconduct, agrees to cooperate and comply, and in exchange the Department of Justice does not prosecute the institution criminally. No corporate conviction, no existential hit to the franchise. No, you're done. Just a negotiated settlement where the institution remains intact, operating privileges preserved, and the scandal is packaged as a completed transaction. The script doesn't present this as a minor legal nuance. It presents it as the central mechanism that explains why nothing changed. Because if the market manipulation is the exploit, the DPA is the safety valve that prevents the exploit from triggering a true system reset. The reason, as framed by the narrator, is systemic risk. This isn't a small shop on a street corner. It's a systemically important institution. Prosecuting it could ripple into instability, runs, credit shocks, collateral damage big enough to scare regulators away from the nuclear option. And that's where the phrase, "too big to jail," becomes more than a slogan. It becomes the operating principle. The script forces the viewer to sit with the moral asymmetry. If an ordinary person admits to fraud, the system doesn't negotiate their continued right to do business. It prosecutes, it cages, it makes an example. But at this tier of finance, the script argues, admission can become a bargaining chip, and punishment can become a payment plan, one that the institution can absorb as a cost of doing business. The number is large enough to sound like justice, yet structured in a way that avoids the one consequence that would actually change incentives: a criminal conviction that threatens licenses, counterparties, access, and survival. That's why the narrator frames the fine less like a verdict and more like a fee, a price paid to keep the machinery lubricated, a controlled burn that protects the forest rather than stopping the arsonist. And once you see it that way, the narrative doesn't feel like they got caught. It feels like they got processed. The audience is pushed toward a harsher inference. This isn't simply law being soft, it's law being calibrated to keep the system functional. The DPA becomes the hinge in the series because it explains the most unsettling part of the whole story: how a documented offense can be absorbed without altering the structure that produced it. The script's promise, right here, is to open the fine print, not to debate whether spoofing is wrong, but to show how the system can acknowledge wrongdoing while designing the consequences to preserve continuity. And once that door opens, the investigation can't stay focused on traders and tactics. It has to move upstream into the architecture of enforcement itself, into the uncomfortable space where justice, stability, and financial infrastructure collide. If the manipulation looks institutional, if it lives in desk culture and process, then the next uncomfortable step is to stop staring at traders and start staring at the referees. Because a rigged game can't run for years on skill alone. It survives because the enforcement loop is designed to be survivable. And this is where the script sharpens its accusation, not just weak policing, but a perverse incentive baked into the system itself. Fines don't just punish, fines also pay. They become revenue streams, headline numbers, political trophies, proof that the state is doing something. But ask the obvious question: if the government gets a cut every time a giant institution breaks the rules, what happens to the incentive to actually end the behavior? Shutting down the offender is the one move that stops future violations, and also stops future payouts. So the script frames the relationship as something closer to revenue sharing than deterrence. Wrongdoing generates a penalty. The penalty feeds the system. The institution survives. The cycle continues. Meanwhile, the public, especially the small traders who got harvested in the chaos, rarely sees anything resembling true restitution. They get a lesson. The system gets a check. That premise shifts the story from scandal to structure. Because once fines function like fees, enforcement starts to look less like justice and more like regulation by meter. You can do the thing, as long as you can afford the ticket. And if that's true, then the big question isn't, why didn't they prosecute harder? It's, What does the system need to protect that makes hard prosecution too expensive? This is where the narrative widens beyond budgets and bureaucracy into currency power, not partisan politics. But the mechanics of confidence. The script leans into a provocative idea. Gold and silver aren't just commodities, they're signals. When they rise hard, they broadcast stress in the currency regime, fear, debasement, loss of trust. In that framing, a runaway metals market becomes a billboard that says, in giant letters, something is wrong. And historically, states do not love uncontrolled billboards about monetary weakness. So the script toys with an implication that's meant to sting. What if suppression isn't merely tolerated, but quietly useful? What if the same institutions caught gaming the metals market also perform a kind of unofficial stabilizing function, outsourced pressure valves that keep the signal from screaming? That's the question the script once lodged in your mind, when enforcement looks gentle. Is it because regulators failed, or because the system prefers a controlled punishment to a true deterrent? In other words, when the DOJ looks at spoofing, do they see only a crime, or do they also see a service that, in the wrong moments, helps keep the larger machine from shaking? Once you accept that enforcement can be managed, the next layer of the story feels less like theory and more like a governance problem hiding in plain sight. Who gets to see the physical metal? And who gets to trade the paper against it? Because if gold and silver are treated as sensitive signals, if stability is a priority, then the most powerful advantage isn't always the fastest algorithm. Sometimes it's simply being positioned at the choke points where information concentrates. And this is where the script drops what it frames as a conflict of interest bomb. The same bank accused of manipulating futures is also portrayed as a custodian for the largest silver ETF. SLV, sitting on top of vault infrastructure, inventory reporting, and flow visibility in major hubs. In other words, the institution isn't just playing the game, it's also holding the scoreboard. Custody, in the script's framing, is not a neutral job. It's informational dominance. A custodian sees what most participants can only guess at: inventory levels, inflows and outflows, operational timing, and the behavioral rhythm of large-scale holders. That knowledge doesn't need to be illegal to be powerful. It's powerful because it exists at all. The narrator's analogy is blunt for a reason. It's like the guy counting chips also playing at the table. Even if he swears he's being fair, he has a perspective no one else can match. And that perspective becomes an edge before any trade is placed. When you combine that with an institution already proven, at least in the narrative's framing, to use deceptive tactics in the paper market, the viewer is meant to feel the implication. This isn't a single exploit. It's a stacked advantage. Then comes the critique of scope, which is where suspicion hardens. The DOJ case, as the script frames it, centers on future spoofing, order book manipulation, fake walls, machine speed deception. But the physical side, the custody structure, the vault ecosystem, the place where real metal lives, appears largely untouched by the enforcement spotlight. And that gap is the narrative's fuel. Because if the paper market can be engineered, and physical custody concentrates information, then the most important questions shift from, did they spoof, to, how deep does the information advantage run? And what rules exist to prevent it from being weaponized? The script doesn't claim to run a technical audit. Instead, it plants a series of governance questions designed to linger. Can ETF metal be leased or used as collateral in ways the public doesn't track cleanly? Can a custodian trade in related markets while having privileged visibility into client flows? If a bank has documented misconduct in one layer of the system, why is it still allowed to occupy a role that grants it unmatched visibility in another? That's the point. The story stops being about one tactic and becomes about architecture. The glitch, in this framing, isn't spoofing alone. It's a stack, paper leverage that can move price, privileged information that can anticipate pressure, and legal insulation that can absorb consequences. Each layer reinforces the next. And when you see the stack, the market starts to look less like a transparent price discovery mechanism and more like a controlled environment where the biggest advantage is simply being close enough to the plumbing to decide what the rest of the world is allowed to see. Once the story builds the stack, paper power, privileged visibility, legal insulation, the next escalation is inevitable. What happens when that stack stops being optional and starts being necessary? Because there's a difference between manipulating a market because it's profitable and manipulating a market because failure means you don't survive. And this is where the script claims the character of suppression changes over time. In the early framing, around 2020, it's offensive. It's about extracting, dominating, hitting quarterly targets, boosting desk performance, earning bonuses, predatory behavior, calculated, confident, the kind of manipulation that looks like a hunter playing with prey. But later, the narrator argues, the motive flips. It becomes defensive, survival, and the new driver isn't just greed, it's a structural trap created by the paper market itself. Banks allegedly sold far more paper silver than they could ever cover with real metal. The script simplifies it into balance sheet logic because it wants the viewer to understand the threat in one clean equation. If a bank holds X ounces, it can short X ounces on paper and sleep at night, because delivery is covered. That's a hedged position. But if the bank shorts far beyond inventory, it's no longer hedged, it's exposed. That's where the phrase, naked short, enters the story, not as a technical detail, but as a narrative alarm bell. Because naked exposure in a commodity isn't just a trade, it's a solvency risk. If price rises, losses don't cap, they expand. The script then pours gasoline on that logic with scale. It points to dramatic quantities, hundreds of millions of ounces of paper liabilities, against a physical reality that can't be conjured by keystrokes. And then it connects the paper trap to a real-world pressure that has nothing to do with charts, industrial demand, solar, electronics, EV infrastructure, sectors that consume silver as input, not as speculation. The implication is simple and brutal. If the world starts pulling silver because it needs it, the market can't rely forever on paper settlement optics. Physical claims rise, delivery matters, and that's where the short becomes unstable. Because shorts are safe only as long as the game stays paper. The moment more players ask for actual metal, directly or indirectly, the promised stack gets stress tested. This section introduces the kill zone concept, a price level above which the short becomes fatal. Not psychologically uncomfortable, financially lethal. Above that line, mark-to-market losses accelerate, collateral demands increase, and counterparties start asking the only question that matters in a crisis: can you pay? If the answer even wobbles, the system doesn't wait politely. It seizes, it liquidates, it forces exits. The script uses this to flip the viewer's emotional framing. Banks are no longer just villains with a cheat code, they become cornered animals. Still dangerous, still capable of violence, but now the violence isn't only about profit. It's about preventing the one outcome they can't afford. A runaway move that exposes the mismatch between paper promises and physical reality. And once suppression becomes survival, the script delivers its final twist. Survival tactics can turn into self-sabotage. Because the moment you start capping price to avoid the kill zone, you're no longer just managing optics, you're running a clock. You're buying time, and time, in commodity markets, is never free. The narrator's endgame logic is that the system eventually becomes self-defeating. The very methods used to prevent a shortage signal end up accelerating the shortage. To keep the tape calm, the story claims, banks flood the market with the appearance of supply, paper selling, fake walls, relentless red candles, anything that tells the world, there's plenty. The goal is psychological. Discourage hoarding, cool demand, keep the signal from screaming. But here's the paradox the script hammers. If you hold the price artificially low while real-world demand is rising, you don't reduce demand, you subsidize it. You turn silver into a discount product for the very players who can drain it the fastest.